This is Brent.
And this is Amanda,
We are the Unreliable Narrators.
here to talk about the strangeness, the mystery, and the wonder of Gene Wolfe's prose.
What is time?
What is memory?
What is a person?
Is this reality?
Where are we?
Do we exist?
Have you ever considered that all your choices are what brought you right here to this very moment?
Episode number 31. Date Due. From the introduction to Gene Wolfe's Book of Days, first published in 1981, and then republished in Castle of Days, the combination of Book of Days and Castle of the Otter, in 1992.
We're already starting off on the wrong foot because it is date due.
Date due, not due date.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm dyslexic, so I read it as due date.
Well, you say that, but I actually had to go back and correct my notes because I had written it down as due date and then realized that I had reversed the words because that's what, I don't know, because that was what I expected or what I was thinking of. But if you look at the top of the library card that would go in the pocket on the inside of a library book, it says date due.
Okay, that makes sense. And now I feel better because
Okay. It wasn't just your mistake. It was both of ours.
yeah.
So basically what you're saying is if we all sin alike, it's more comfortable that way?
No.
Oh, okay.
So this one, I was actually just flipping through the Castle of Days and I saw this and it was interesting to me because we just got done with Bibliomen. And this feels like a hidden Biblioman in another work.
I had the exact same thought. And in fact, that's in my notes. And I feel like you must have looked over my shoulder because it feels like another story that would fit with Bibliomen. But this, of course, is in a different work. This is in Gene Wolfe's Book of Days, which is a collection of stories related to particular holidays or significant dates, including the opening day of hunting season, which I think is great, that he has a story for that holiday, which isn't a holiday unless you're in a hunting community, in which case it definitely is. But it's not one of the short stories in the collection. It's a hidden story in the introduction.
Whenever you think you've seen Wolfe do everything, then he does this.
Yeah. So if you read the introduction, he writes a good introduction to the collection. And the introduction has wonderful comments and interesting things in it. But he also says that his editors tell him no one reads introductions. And so he's hiding this story in the introduction. And it's an extra treat for you if you're the kind of person who reads introductions, which he says he also is. He says, my editors tell me no one reads introductions, but I do. So,
yeah. So we have nonfiction and then fiction dispersed in here. So I do want to go through the nonfiction section because I think he has a bunch of interesting little nuggets in here. But like you already mentioned, it's like we are a member of a select minority because we read introductions.
at least well enough to find the hidden stories in them.
Mm-hmm. And then the second thing he points out here is that, yes, he really is Gene Wolfe, and he actually is writing his own introduction.
Yes, he does.
And in the third paragraph, he actually begins talking about certain things that I find punchy's not necessarily the word, but I've brought this up before where Wolfe had expressed concern and frustration at the level of critical feedback that he got amongst fandom and amongst critics. And so what he says here, to begin with, they are largely what is called science fiction, though a good many are of the type of science fiction that is sometimes questioned, particularly by people who do not read much SF and therefore have very definite ideas about what it is and is not.
I think punchy is the word for that sentence because he's saying these are SF, and the people who tell you that my stories aren't SF are people who don't read enough to know that I'm right in the mainstream of imaginative context.
I've posted some of the reviews when I've been going through old fanzines
Right.
and I've been finding them, I've been posting those to Patreon. It's nowhere near comprehensive, but
But it's at least enough of a sampling of reviews of his work that if you go to the Patreon page and read those reviews, you'll have a sense of why he was frustrated at critics not getting him, because they weren't getting him, and then critiquing him for not doing a thing that he wasn't trying to do, or critiquing him for doing something that, yeah, just inaccuracies and lack of familiarity with the context. Because he is doing something that's different, which is very literary SF, but it's still very SF.
uh-huh. And then he pairs that comment with the people complain about his humor.
Yes. It's a great line. I have a sense of humor that makes strong men faint and women reach for weapons.
Yep. I don't know. That cracks me up because he does have a lot of dad jokes or kind of the bolts behind the superstructure of his stories. So,
Yeah, and then he has a paragraph about how he will not bore the reader with a description of how he came to write these stories. There are plenty of books to teach you how to write. Most of them aren't any good. But then he says, but I would like to leave you with a handful of words on how to read stories, these stories at least. And I really like that. The idea that we don't just need to talk about how to write stories, but knowing how to read stories well is itself an intellectual skill.
yeah, and I feel like it's an important thing. Let me step back. There's a lot of conversation going on online about book talk and booktube and whatever, bookgram, and I don't even know what else we it's like my book, if anybody uses MySpace anymore. But
Linked book.
yeah, linked book. There's just gets to be a lot of it's just consumption where and one of the things that I've seen where people are like, oh, I said I was going to read 50 books on Goodreads this year. I need 10 more. Does anybody know short books so I can just breeze through them? And you kind of turning books into a consumption without reflection.
Right. Or treating it like side quests in a game that you know, like we're going to rack up some experience points, but this is not something we care about, or we're checking things off of a list, or putting up numbers to put up numbers.
Yeah.
I say as someone who likes to brag about how many books she reads every year. But anyway, enough with the self-awareness. Back to Gene Wolfe.
So I urge you to not read one after another, the way I eat potato chips.
Excellent Pringles joke right there.
Yep. The simple act of closing this book and putting it away for another day will do a great deal for the story you have just read and even more for the next.
Yeah, and then he says, if you are a purist, you might even go so far as to read each story on the designated day, which is, I think, a great suggestion.
An article about hunting at the opening day of deer season, the war beneath the tree before Christmas.
Yes.
And that's, we think of short story collections, but at the same time, Wolfe is getting at something here that short stories, even though they may be contained in a collection, rarely are they meant to just be consumed as though they were all part of a whole.
Right. They're not chapters of a book. They are separate works of art.
Yeah. So, yes, they are a part of a whole in the sense that they're part of an author's entire body of work, but most of the time people aren't building. It's like, oh, this is my second short story, and it won't make any sense to you if you haven't read my first one.
Right. Right.
So that's just encouragement to slow down, stop and consider and ponder things.
Yeah, and he goes on to say, you know, even if you're not a purist and not going to read them on the particular days, you should contemplate their contexts and intentions and the setting that he's creating before and after you read them. Think about the appropriate things in order to put yourself into the place to be receptive to them. And I think that's just generally good advice. Trying to understand the author's context for a work, true of short stories, poems, and novels, trying to put yourself into a place where you can perceive as well as possible everything that is going on here.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I see, and frustrates me quite a bit, where people will assume that a short story is just now, but in a different imaginary place where none of the worldview or the culture or any changes in technology or beliefs or religion would have any sort of change on a character.
Right.
And this isn't just true of Wolfe, but a lot of critiques that I see online where people are trying to interact with either a short story or a novel, they'll be like, well, I couldn't get past this because the character treated women this way, or one thing you'll be like, there was no trans characters in there. And you can add any flavor in there. Like, I've seen it on left and right, but if you're approaching a work of art, you're meeting the mind of the artist and entering into something else.
Yeah, and your context for agreeing or disagreeing with their particular opinions or positions on things is not the same as your context for appreciating or not appreciating this as a work of art. It certainly seems characteristic of growing up in evangelical subculture in the 90s, where there were so many things that were banned, effectively banned within the community that I grew up in, because it contained representations of things that evangelical subculture disagreed with. So the most extreme example was I was initially not allowed to read C.S. Lewis because witches are bad, and a story about the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe would be bad because it has a representation of something that is forbidden, beyond the pale. And sort of origination of cancel culture, I don't know that that's actually historically the origination of it, but in my experience, the first cancel culture that I encountered was, we are destroying these tapes or CDs or DVDs or books, or just not purchasing or participating in this because there is a representation of something I disagree with.
Yeah. Evangelicals won the culture war.
They did. They don't realize it, though.
Yeah, it's just the beliefs that were behind the actions are different.
Yeah.
I feel like I need a change my mind sign and sit out on it.
Yeah, sit down on a quad somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then the next paragraph, he does literally say, try to put aside your preconceptions. Don't be disappointed when you discover, as you will, that I am not Harlan Ellison or Isaac Asimov. Harlan and Isaac, as they would be the first to admit, are not me either. That's a great paragraph.
It is. And I'm also just thinking of Wolfe in some of his other ones. Like, he knew Asimov and Ellison, and he has comments in other stories where I can't remember the name of it now, but there's the one with the record where the little boy's uncle buys it for him, but the uncle has a heart attack and he doesn't listen to the record until many years later. And in the introduction, he's got a joke at Asimov's expense where where Asimov said, finally, a story that just means what it says, or something along those lines.
Right.
Actually the opposite, but...
Yeah. The next two paragraphs are, I feel, Wolfe through time, since this came out in, what was it, 81, when both of your unreliable narrators were mere infants. But I feel like Wolfe reached through time to pander to both Brent and Amanda in these two paragraphs. Would you like to read them, or shall I?
You'll probably do a way better job.
Oh, okay. Lastly, let me urge you to treat this and all books with respect. We will all benefit if you do. You cannot judge this book now. You will not even be able to judge it rightly when you have read its last story. 10 or 20 years from now, you will know it was a good book if you remember any of the tales you are about to read. Meanwhile, its author begs you to preserve it as a physical object so that at an appropriate time it can be shared by others. If you have bought it, those others may be friends you have not met or children you have thus far only dreamed of. If you have borrowed it from a library, they are your peers in the community, having the same rights in it as yourself. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. If it wasn't so wordy, I'd get it put on a t-shirt.
Yeah, or tattoo. No, that's so fantastic. One of the earliest things that Brent and I bonded over way back in the early stages of our friendship was the love of the book as a physical object and the care for a book as a physical object. One of the earliest extremely decided opinions I remember hearing from Brent
Oh
is
boy.
your very, very strong feeling that hardcover books are superior to paperbacks because as physical objects, they tend to last longer and are more durable. And then from that point on, it's like sewn bindings versus glued bindings, preserved dust jackets as best as possible, good shelving, carefully shelved books, understanding that the appropriate way to store a book is upright on a shelf with other books of a similar size in a slightly compressed but not too tight pattern. Yeah, all of this is the kind of thing that's incredibly important to me. I think part of it is that if I preserve this and care for this very well, then someday someone else may read it. Of course, running counter to that is my unwillingness to loan books to someone else if I don't believe that they will take good care of it.
Yeah.
But then also, I was just emailing Dan Knight, and he was asking what I knew about the fires in LA and that he'd been following the news. And one of the stories that he'd heard was of a man whose house burned and his 4,000 book library was destroyed in the fire.
Oh.
And so we were talking about how, as collectors, because he's also a collector in his own way, as collectors of books, things do become more scarce on a regular basis because of things like this, but also that collecting and preserving impulse is about trying to hold back that tide of destruction as long as possible.
Well, and for the I didn't know what you were going to say.
About what?
About my early opinions. And I was like, oh boy.
Okay. He did flinch when I started talking about his early opinions. But to be fair, I'm accurate, right?
Uh-huh. Yes.
Yeah.
And for the listener, I do still stand behind those probably very strongly held opinions from youth. So.
Yes. Well, and I have not ever regretted holding those opinions or working for those things. I don't tend to loan my books out very easily. I only really loan them out to people I know will take good care of them. Side note, that really means it's just to Brent. But I will happily buy and share books with people so that they can have their own copies, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But preserving books is really important to me. And I do hope that someone else will get to enjoy and read these at some point, not just that they would be entombed, never to be appreciated.
Yeah, no, that's a difficult thing for me too, because I will upload things to archive.org. And I've been involved in the Project Gutenberg project for way back in the day.
Many, many years.
Yeah, so I very much have that impulse like, oh, this book is a hard book to get a hold of. Like, this needs to be out in case somebody wants to read it. But also, it's that people that tend to be in that, oh, well, we got a digital copy of it now. Now we can mistreat the physical object. I dislike that impulse.
Right. And I think that, well, yes, also listeners, some of my earliest memories of young Brent were him scanning and digitizing obscure versions of the Bible and compiling them and then mailing out discs that had these files on them. Like, you could order up a disc that had, I don't even know how many different versions you had on them. And he did artwork for the CD case. And so that idea of like making sure that people have access to things is a co-equal thread in many ways. So it's not save this physical copy and hide it away. It's save this physical copy, preserve it, because the physical object itself has an intrinsic historical value and a permanence that a digital file doesn't. I mean, yes, a 4,000 book library can go up in a wildfire, but also a digital copy can be wiped from the memory of a computer somewhere.
Yeah. That's that was a trip down memory lane there. Like, oh yeah.
You forgot about those,
well,
or hadn't thought of them for a while?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've thought about that.
I took a class in my undergraduate degree where we, during one class period, the professor discussed the inverse relationship between density of information and durability of information. how there are clay tablets from 3,000 years ago that are as legible today as the day they were made. There's carvings in stone from 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, that is nearly as legible today as the day it was carved, depending on how exposed to the elements it was. How in the Middle Ages, manuscripts inscribed on parchment, animal skin, that oak gall ink and parchment is incredibly durable.
Mm-hmm.
And you can open a manuscript and the text is bright and legible, pretty much as it was when it was first written.
Yeah.
And modern books, especially ones where no consideration has been made for the relative acidity of the paper, they can begin to fall apart in as little as 40 or 50 years, which is a much shorter time frame than the 500, 1,000 years of a vellum manuscript. But then the durability of digital media, they're very ephemeral. And so the durability of digital media is related to its maintenance and recopying, not to the stability of its encoded form.
Yeah. Well, it's like the famous example with the Domesday Book, where the original's still around, but there's a whole project for Laserdisc and VHS decoding, which is taking the actual signal, but you're processing it as audio and then putting it back into digital video that came about because the Laserdiscs that they archived, preserved the Domesday Book onto, it's just not accessible anymore unless you have a Laserdisc player and then copies of the Laserdiscs.
Right. But the manuscript is still legible.
Yep.
I mean, some of these manuscripts, you think about Lindisfarne Gospels, a couple of other very famous Book of Kells, literally buried in a swamp. And then when Viking raiders were going Viking and assaulting monasteries and then pulled out and, maybe there's a little water staining, but they're actually still there, still readable. Anyway, so that 2 paragraphs, long digression, but it makes my soul sing. So I'm happy that Wolfe expressed these opinions because, I feel righter. I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's just good to know that he valued books as physical objects.
Yes, very much so.
So now let me tell you a story.
Yeah. And with that intro, it's basically like a 1.25 page long short story. And this is Date Due. So in summary, the story's about a college student.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, college student. When he's in the library, he realizes that there's a exit door.
Yes, a hidden exit door.
Hidden exit door. So on the outside, it's covered by bushes. Inside, there's a foreign language bookshelf that's mostly covering it. So people don't know about it. So he uses it to sneak books out of the library.
Yeah, 3 or 4 books a day.
Which just seems excessive, but...
Says the man with thousands of books.
Hey.
What do you have? Shelves for, 30% of your book collection at this point?
Yeah. Well, anyway.
Yeah, so he's sneaking books out of the library because he doesn't have to check them out, and so he won't have to return them. Gradually, his apartment fills with books until he actually becomes frightened and overwhelmed by how many books he has.
Yeah, what's it say? He sat thinking how he might free himself from his thousands of stolen volumes. He feared they might fall and crush him.
Yes, which, again, autobiographical note, I have had people joke that that's how I'm going to go, and I would not be surprised. Now, at this point, all of my bookshelves are firmly affixed to the walls, but I could definitely die at 85 under a pile of books that fell over on me. I could see it happening.
So he's got so many books that he's at the point where he's like, should I just return them to the library?
But you can't return something you haven't checked out.
Yeah, and then he's suspecting that the head librarian has caught on to what he's doing.
Yes. And he thinks about maybe mailing them back, but he's worried that he won't be able to afford the postage to do so.
Yeah, and then he considers arson.
Yes, he does. Set his apartment on fire.
So then it would just be burned up and forgotten about.
Yeah, and then he settles on the plan of getting a discarded stamp made so that he can stamp each of the books as discarded from his university library and then open a used bookstore with them.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, this is just great.
it is. He turns down a job so he can go through in this. So in October, he would sell his car and jogging shoes, borrow all the money he could, and open a small used bookstore. The thought of having a rack of birthday cards somewhere near the door cheered him.
That's a great touch.
One fine day in May, as he was considering means of attracting shoplifters.
Excellent touch as well, because he wants them to be stolen because they're so overwhelming to him.
Yeah, okay, that's the way I read it too, and I was
Yep.
going to ask you on that. Yeah, that one.
And it's also, that's a perennial problem for bookstores. Theft is an incredibly high percentage of books lost in a used bookstore. They're stolen constantly.
Huh.
All used bookstores have this problem.
I'm kind of surprised by that, but then I'm like do I just assume readers are better people, or
You're committing some kind of fallacy here. I'm not sure what it is, but
I'm not sure either, but
yeah, no, it's a constant problem.
okay, well, humanity never loses an opportunity to disappoint me.
Yes, there we go.
So he's thinking about the shoplifters.
Yep, he has a plan.
Yeah, he has a plan. He returned to his apartment and opened the door to see the sight he had most dreaded during all the grim years when he had been drowning in hoarded volumes. The head librarian sat waiting for him in his own chair, the only one clear of books, in his own living dining kitchenette. He would have fainted if he could, but he had never been quick.
I love that.
She had never been slow, and at this crucial moment, she was icily calm. "I am sorry, sir," she said, "but this branch closes in 5 minutes."
And then it says he's homeless until 9:30 on Monday morning.
Yeah, so he got kicked out of his own apartment because he stole so many of the library's books.
And she figures it out and then uses the social pressure of the librarian, the cultural cachet of the stern librarian to kick him out of his own house.
Uh-huh. I don't know. It's just a funny story because he's got so much stuff.
Yeah, so there's a ton of stuff packed in there. He does close the introduction with the very brief paragraph. "This has been the story for date due. The people who do not read introductions missed it." So that's how it closes out.
Yeah. So I think
Yes.
listeners will understand why I was like, oh yeah, Bibliomen. This feels like one that could slide in there fairly easily.
Yes, very easily. I enjoyed it on several levels, partly because it's embedded in the introduction, which has several expressions in it that I find very congenial and interesting, partly just because it's just a fun story about that book hoarding tendency. I also just love that the solution to his problems is to open a used bookstore. Opening a used bookstore created many problems for me. So that's a fun little reversal there. But it also is very resonant with the world of bibliomania. So Bibliomen is great because it has all of these characters that are into books in a variety of ways. But if anyone has read Nicholas Basbane's A Gentle Madness, it's this wonderful volume about the history of bibliomania and whether or not it actually qualifies as a mental illness or not, because it has sometimes been regarded historically as a mental illness. And he catalogs all these different instances of the collecting impulse. And there is one really interesting story in there about an American man who was just so taken with books, but had no money. And so he spent decades stealing books from various libraries. And he stole thousands and thousands of volumes, many times very valuable volumes. So he stole lots of collectible books. Now, anyone in the book collecting world knows that an ex-library copy is the least valuable kind of copy in the collecting world. But he taught himself, he was completely self-taught in book repair. And
Oh.
so he used a variety of techniques in order to remove library stickers and pockets, remove the writing on the spine that very often happens, and lift stamps and all kinds of things out of and off of the books in order to make them as beautiful as possible. But he didn't put them on the collectible market. He just wanted to have the books. And so he was eventually caught. His house was full of these books. He had been pursued for a very long time, but he stole from so many different libraries, and they didn't all know that they were all having this problem until
Oh.
eventually an investigator started to put two and two together, and then ends up with the problem that the libraries were missing more books than he had. And there were often multiple libraries claiming the same volume that was found in his collection, because you'd have two or three different libraries that were missing one collectible book. And he had stolen one of the copies, but the other two are still out there somewhere.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, yeah, he eventually actually served jail time over it. Yeah, I mean, it was theft of quite a lot of valuable property. So, I really enjoyed that story when I read it. And Basbane's book, A Gentle Madness, is wonderful if you have the chance to read it.
Okay. So you do recommend.
Oh, very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, he's written several. They're all on the same general topic of book collecting and book mania of various types. I think A Gentle Madness is the best of them. But yeah, I would highly recommend them.
Okay. Yeah, this section, I think that this introduction interests me in terms of just Wolfe's craft as a writer, because a lot of times it's like a rare opportunity to see how Wolfe connects his nonfiction ideas with the actual fiction. And I wrote down, my note here is like a chiasmus structure.
Nice.
So like a chiasmus, like you see this a lot in the Bible with like the Psalms or sections of Proverbs where it goes through and you have a doubling of ideas. And I feel like where we have the nonfiction section where he's talking about the importance of books as physical objects, and then don't destroy them.
Don't read them like potato chips.
Yeah. And then as a member of a community, everybody in that community has the same right to those books in the library. And so he has some very strong statements.
Yes.
But then we don't get like a simple little neat moral tied up. So it's like, even though we know, oh, every member of the community has the same rights to those books as you do, we don't get that at the end. We get a comical, like the librarian's using her position as a librarian to kick him out of his own house because he's stolen the books. And it's really more just comical. And I mean, yeah, you could ferret out the, hey, yeah, maybe don't steal books, but it's like multiple steps removed.
And it's subtle because by naming his apartment as a branch of the library, she is asserting that these books belong to the community, but she doesn't say that.
No. So it's fun. I think it's interesting to see how Wolfe takes ideas and then moves it into fiction. And, you know, you just sometimes you read some of the discussions online, or, okay, let's not blame other people, but sometimes I read something in Wolfe and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's clearly this idea.
Right.
And then later I'll find a comment where he explicitly said, oh, yeah, I read this and that's how I came up with this. It's like, oh, wow, I was way off base with where I thought the source of either an idea or a belief or something that he was working with came from. So I think that this, even though it's a small story, I think it's important for a glimpse in there.
I think that's delightfully constructed. I like what you said about that connection between his nonfiction thoughts about the importance of books being so closely juxtaposed with this story, that I hadn't really thought about it in quite those terms. But so this story made me think about Basbane's A Gentle Madness. Is it okay if I bring in another story that I think it connects to?
Oh, yes.
Are you sure?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so the short story that was shared in Writers Group, Unreliable Brent here wrote a short story, and it seems to me to be strongly connected to Date Due, although I'm fairly sure you hadn't read Date Due before you wrote the story.
That is a correct statement.
Yeah, so there's just a confluence here of ideas. Also, I did not call out this strong Brent opinion earlier, but I'm going to bring it up now. Along with that sense of the necessity of preservation and care for books, I would say both Brent and I have pretty complicated feelings about libraries and librarians. Most librarians, as a cultural image, librarians have a very positive one today in our culture, I think, in general, in that they're people that facilitate the act of reading for a lot of people. However, library practices tend to do a lot of things that damage the appearance and structural integrity of books. And so even some of the things that they do to attempt to preserve the physical structure of the book also permanently alters the structure of a book. Taped on plastic covers, stamps, stickers, glued in things. And then there's also the classic library binding where it may be sturdy, but they tend to be very just unattractive, poorly designed, or not aesthetically pleasing. So some years ago, Brent wrote a short story called The Parables of the Treasure and the Pearl, and then apologized later for writing overly long titles for short stories. For anyone who doesn't know, those parables appear in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. And in the King James Version translation, which the reason for which will be clear in a moment, they go, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchantman seeking goodly pearls, who when he has found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it." So then the short story is, in summary, it's a grad student who's hunting for a thesis topic. And he figures out that his university library holds an old Bible that is possibly a first printing, a first edition of the King James Version. So he turns his thesis project into an investigation of the points by which you can determine whether or not this is a first edition King James Version or not. At the same time, he enlists the publicity of the school paper, and he meets a reporter at the paper, and they have several interviews where they talk about the book and how his project is going. And then through various twists and turns involving a book repair specialist, he submits his thesis declaring that the university does not, in fact, have a first edition. It's a later printing. The first edition has several distinctives that this volume does not have. Places an interesting order with the book repair person, enlists the help of the book repair person in removing some stickers and stamps on a volume of some sort. And then there is a very hard scene cut right at the end where it seems like he has moved into a new house from his tiny little grad school apartment, and hung on the wall is a single page of a Bible displaying Matthew 13, 44 through 46. So, Brent, as the author, would you like to talk a little bit about your short story here?
Well, I have no choice.
I didn't ask permission ahead of time, just FYI.
No, I'm slightly embarrassed, but that's
okay. You'll get over it.
Yeah. What do you want me to talk about it?
Do you see any connection between your work here and Gene Wolfe's?
Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, there's definitely that rooting for the underdog.
Yes.
Because there's, I mean, in some sense, the main character is a Jacob, like a heel catcher.
Yes.
And even though he's a bit squirrely and maybe not somebody we always would view as the most upright.
Yes.
He's taking the advantages as he's seeing them, and he's blessed for it. There's a bit of that, because he has a point in there where it's like, oh, well, what would happen if this was confirmed to be the first printing? And he has that moment of realization that it's like, oh, well, it's just going to be locked up in the library vault and nobody will ever see it.
Well, and I think you do a really great job with this. You juxtapose that realization quite effectively with what the context is. He found this on the open stacks.
Yes.
He found this Bible just on the open stacks, not being cared for. No one's aware that it's possibly a first edition.
Mm-hmm.
It's just shelved like any other library book, and therefore vulnerable to frequent handling or damage. It's not being appreciated in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And it has all of the typical marks on the spine and stamps and a glued-in checkout pocket, because somebody could check it out. And so you've got this. I like how you call Jacob a heel catcher. That's wonderful. And he's not like a heroic character. You're like, okay, you're just kind of an idiot. He's just trying to make things work for himself. He's not a charming character.
No, he's not.
But then he's realizing, okay, this is just being ignored. Oh, but if I draw attention to it, it might just get locked away and hidden, and then it's not doing anything for anyone, but it could do something for me.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah, like you said, he's not an outright hero.
No, he's not. I do want to read a paragraph about the neglect of the book. Out on the stacks, with the only protections being the institutional lack of respect for the past that the university instills in all its graduates, and an atrophied sense of curiosity that comes with getting a diploma.
Okay, well, I wrote that. I don't quite remember.
I love that line because it's, in some ways, things actually are preserved because of indifference. I mean, the snarkiness toward institutions, I just enjoyed that. But that's actually like a reality of the world, that there are things that are saved in a way because no one cared about them.
Yeah. You read Ada Palmer's Reading Lucretius.
Yes, I did.
You were telling me the story from the introduction. Wasn't it the last of his manuscript in the West? It was under a table leg?
Yes.
Where they found it?
Yes. It was a prop.
Yeah.
As in like a physical prop, holding something up. Yeah. De rerum natura. And then there it is, just being used as a physical prop.
Yeah. So this type of stuff happens.
Yes, quite often.
And the way I choose to look at it, which I think Wolfe would also agree on this, if I'm not being too presumptuous. But there is a neglect and indifference in the final sum of all things is also a tool of the divine.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I think he would agree with that.
And I think that it's only in retrospect that we can see the providence in it. So.
Yeah, that indifference or being able to escape notice is a way for certain vulnerable persons or objects to be preserved when there is no other way.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I think it's a fun juxtaposition, these two stories. One, I actually just really enjoyed this story when you first shared it. But then there is kind of a balancing here with Date Due, where we have the librarian preserving communal access to books through her actions, and where we have this character kind of getting away with taking something from a library, but in a way that makes his life. And it also seems like the reporter from the school newspaper might be moving in with him. So improving their prospects for the future through their appreciation of something that was otherwise neglected.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can say anything more brilliant than my quote just a minute ago. So
you have no more to add than that.
Yeah, I feel like that might be the high point in my comments for this episode.
That you wrote an entire, 8,000 word short story about a first edition of the King James Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And that works. Okay.
Did you have anything else you wanted to discuss on this one?
I don't think that I have any other details or comments that I want to bring to light. I appreciate that what you said about neglect being a kind of providence. And I think that this is one of the things that I consistently love in Gene Wolfe's work and in other works that speak to my soul in the same way, which is that the created universe is complex in ways that we can't imagine, and that straightforward answers are right in some circumstances, but inevitably wrong in other circumstances. And
Mm-hmm.
so wisdom is a complex path, and good is always a complex reality. And so many of Wolfe's characters are trying to do a good thing and do a bad thing instead, but then that bad thing has good effects or some other more convoluted and layered complexity there, that there are seeds of goodness, or there is the capacity of goodness in all of these kinds of things.
Yeah.
We're talking about an author who's like, okay, so for my great work, I will make the main character a torturer. And then for my next great work, I will make the main character a priest who's also a thief. Have fun.
Yep.
The Unreliable Narrators are Amanda Patchen and Brent Towell. And as Gene Wolfe said, time itself is a thing, so it seems to me, that stands solidly like a fence of iron palings with its endless row of years, and we flow past, like guile, on our way to a sea from which we shall return only as rain.